beloved, if you will open your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 11. We have finally arrived. 2 Samuel chapter 11. This is not a good scene, a good story. It's one of the saddest stories in David's life. David has been accurately portrayed as a man after God's own heart. We've seen that over and over again. He was devoted to the law. Chapter 9 and verse 7 talks about that, or it demonstrates that. He was not derailed by the accumulation of treasures and money. We saw that in chapter 8, verses 11 and 12. David also resisted the temptation to do evil, particularly the evil of revenge. When we think about what Saul did to him, Saul returned evil to David for the good that David had done to him or for him. And David returns good for evil. And some examples are in 1 Samuel chapter 24 and verse 11. Chapter 17, verse 11, and also verses 17 and 18. And also chapter 26 and verse 18. There are examples there of David doing good to Saul in spite of what Saul does to him. And there's another case. Remember Nabal and Abigail. You remember the time when David was bent on harming Nabal. Through Abigail's insistence, through her intervention, her wise intervention, he was prevented from shedding bloodshed. So David, again, in that sense, demonstrated a man after God's own heart because he listened to counsel, he listened to wisdom, and he recognized what he heard was right and accurate, and he stayed his anger, his frustration at her husband. Indeed, Abigail expresses the hope that evil will not be found in David for as long as he lives. Abigail and David both saw the wisdom of God and the hand of God in what David wanted to do, but he didn't follow through in doing. They both see the wisdom and they see God's hand in these events. And Abigail in chapter 25 of 1 Samuel expresses her desire that evil never be found in David or be a part of David, but her hope was not fulfilled. In David's affair with Bathsheba and with the subsequent murder of Uriah, David acted too much like Saul in returning evil for good. Whereas he responded positively to the word of the Lord as delivered by Abigail in the Bathsheba affair, he despised the word of the Lord by doing what was evil in the Lord's eyes. And that's going to come in the next chapter in verse 9, where it says, "Why have you despised the word of the Lord by doing evil in his sight?" Nathan's words are going to be to him. David will suffer even physical effects from unconfessed sin, as recorded in Psalms 32 and verse 50 and 51. But eventually he will acknowledge his sin as a man after God's own heart does. He confesses his sin. But this matter here is something that's sad. In fact, some older commentators would say, they have written that if David would have died, if he would have just quit at this point, he would have finished the race, completed the course, and had done very well. But we have this extra part in his life that's included in Scripture, of course. His sin, David's sin of adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah might have been the perfect crime. You think about this. Could have been the perfect crime. David was not accountable to anyone in his kingdom. Very likely he could have, and he did try to conceal these events, these developments from everyone. David fabricated a lie from the perfectly legitimate war against Ammon to cover up his murderous intentions toward an innocent man. He used the war against Ammon as a cover-up or a ruse to get rid of Uriah when Uriah would not go and stay with his wife. Things that from Scripture, things that we think that David would not have done or could not have done, David does in these 2 chapters here. It is remarkable how sin can shield or blur known truth. David knew what he was doing was wrong. Psalm 18 and verse 20. In that psalm, David acknowledges that the Lord had had rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanliness of my hands, he has recompensed me. That's Psalm 18 and verse 20. David recognizes and he writes that God has rewarded him according to his deeds. He recognizes that it's God who does that God would not have done that if he had acted sinfully in some way. Psalm 52 reflects David's encounter with Doeg. Remember Doeg? He's the Edomite. Remember, he went to look for food and supplies while he was running from Saul. He found Goliath's sword. Doeg, the Edomite, told on him, ratted on him to Saul, and Saul got mad and killed, 85 of those priests. Remember that occasion? Well, Psalm 52 reflects David's encounter with that Edomite, Doeg, and his actions. And David writes this in verse 3, "You love evil more than good, falsehood more than speaking what is right." You think about that. You love evil more than speaking what is right. And then we'll see next week in verses 6 through 13 what he does here. David does not speak what is right. So the question, if anyone would ever raise the issue, did David know about this? Is this perhaps early in his life? No, it's not early in his life. And yes, he did know these things. So once again, it's remarkable how sin can shield or blur known truth. You and I know a great deal of truth, and yet we are just as capable of gross sin as David was. These reflect the knowledge of deep truths and hatred of sin. Now David acted as if God would not reward me according to his behavior. David's desire blinded him to everything that he knew was right, and that is the deceitfulness of sin. You remember, if you were here this morning, you talked about changing the lights because they just keep getting dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. And you and I probably don't notice it because we're only here for 3 or 4 or 5 hours a day, and it's only once a week, and we probably don't notice it. But if we were to put new lights in and then it would be bright, we would notice that. That's kind of illustrating the deceitfulness of sin. It happens so subtly, inch by inch, centimeter by centimeter, so subtly that we often don't realize what's going on until you reach a point where God wakes you up, somebody wakes you up, and you realize, and you look around and you're so far off the target in your thought and in your actions. That's the deceitfulness of sin. That's the characteristic of sin. That's what it does. So what David is going to do is commit adultery, and then he's going to murder one of his most loyal and able officers and trying to cover it up. Not pleasant chapters. David's blinded him. David's desire blinded him from everything that he knew was right. The immediate satisfaction, this is his thinking here, it so overwhelmed him. The immediate satisfaction completely cut off or completely eclipsed the fact that God always knows. There was something that happened to David. And from what we can tell here, it was very fast. It was not a long affair. It was not many nights, so to speak. It was a one-time fling very quickly. David wasn't ready. He didn't have, we would say that David didn't have the armor of God on. He was not ready. He was caught off guard, as we'll note that here, and he was overwhelmed. That's not an excuse, but that's what happened. Davis, one of the commentators, last name is Davis, he wisely warns all the readers, and he says, if you begin to say, "Oh, but I could never," then you have already taken the first step in your fall. Don't ever be surprised at what you are capable of. Wise statement. God was gracious to spare David's life from being stoned. You see, that was the punishment for adultery. If they had followed the law, in this case, David and Bathsheba would have been stoned. That was the punishment. Another evidence of divine mercy that was that the future king Solomon would come from, another piece of mercy here is that the future king Solomon would come from Bathsheba. Bathsheba is going to have 4 or 5 boys, and Solomon's the youngest of them. And from Bathsheba will come the next king. Yet another evidence is the fact that the dynastic covenant promises, that the promises to David and his family, graciously given to David, remained. And David receives total forgiveness from all of that. So in spite of the severity of the thing that he did and how it affected other people, God's grace is still evident here. God spared their lives. The future king would come from Bathsheba. His name would be Solomon. All the promises that God made to David, he kept them there. David receives total forgiveness. So God's grace is evident in numerous ways in this story, in spite of the grossness of the act that's committed here. However, the blessings talked about in the law, the Torah blessings resulting from obedience, went away. Remember in the Torah, the law to Israel, if you obey me, I will bless you. If you do not obey me, I will not bless you. And so those kinds of blessings that's mentioned in the law that were to result from obedience, they all disappeared. Most of them disappeared. In their place, David began to experience the curses that are talked about in the law, including the loss of family. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 18 talks about the loss of family and exile. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 64 through 67 talk about exile. And David experienced both of them. He lost sons, and he was kicked out of his home for a while when his son Absalom tried to usurp the throne. He experienced both of those curses. However, though the effects of sin will linger throughout all of his life, the remainder of his life. In fact, David's sin and repentance are recorded here in chapters 11 and 12. Chapter 13 is going to record one of his sons' sin and the results of that. The latter part of chapter 13, all the way through chapter 18, is going to be Absalom's insurrection, his rebellion, and his defeat. And then in chapters 19 and 20, David is finally going to recover his throne. So all of these things result because of his sin. Not a matter of forgiveness, but just the effects of sin that ripple through the lives of people. The parallel account, we've seen that many cases there will be a parallel account in 1 Chronicles, but the parallel account in 1 Chronicles is limited to 2 verses. Only 2 verses. Samuel spotlights David's troubles resulting from his sin. The Chronicles, the writer to the Chronicles, focuses on David's achievements. So Chronicles is going to give very positive David. Samuel is going to give a little bit more realistic David. That's the way they write. Though David's personal life was in turmoil, God continued to use his faltering servant to bless the nation. There's no doubt about that. All of chapter 11 and 12 takes place during the war with Ammon. So what you have is 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1. We have verse 1. Then it happened in the spring, at the time when the judges go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, that's the capital, but David stayed in Jerusalem. That verse right there is recorded in 1 Chronicles chapter 20 and verse 1. And then in 1 Chronicles chapter 20 and verse 2, you read this. You read this. Then he took the crown of their king from his head, and its weight was a talent of gold, and in it was a precious stone, and he placed it on David's head. And he brought out the spoil of the city in great amounts. That's your Chronicles parallel. 1 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 1, David and everybody went out, all Israel went out to fight. David stayed at home. 1 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 2, they took the crown, the victory crown, off of the king of Ammon and placed it on David's head, and it weighed a talent of gold. That's all the Chronicles says. In between those two verses in 1 Chronicles 20 lies almost all of chapter 11 and 12 in 2 Samuel. So you can see that's the emphasis. Chronicles will give you David in the positive sense, and 2 Samuel will give you David in the more realistic sense. Here's all the nice things and all the not so nice things that he did. So that's how they go. Some general observations will be helpful. The pace at chapter 11, you'll notice, since you've been sitting here through chapter 8, 9, and 10, you'll notice that the pace of chapter 11 moves much slower. We're not just covering battles that lasted perhaps months in 2 or 3 verses. Now it slows down. The center of attention is David and his sin. That's the whole focus. The writer withholds much information that we would long to know, but the focus again is David. We want to know more about Bathsheba. We want to know more about Uriah. We want to know more details. David doesn't give us any detail, or the Lord doesn't give us details. He keeps the focus on David. Don't lose sight of David's sin. That's his point here. There is little information about or from Uriah or Bathsheba is available, and the only words from Bathsheba that we hear in this whole scene right here is verse 5. She says 3 words in verse 5. I am pregnant. That's it. That's all we know. She talks a little bit. We have some more words from her towards the end of David's life because she is protecting her son Solomon from being usurped from the throne. But that's all she says. The only words from Uriah occur in verse 11. And they are words that are more to be admired than King David's words. So Uriah and Bathsheba are treated as bystanders, as if they really do not factor in the story. We do not know what their feelings were, nor do we know why Uriah acted as he did. Was it because he suspected something afoul in Jerusalem? Was it because were there other things that factored in? We're not told. We do not and we cannot know these matters. We do not know what Joab thought about David's ruse to eliminate Uriah. All this is sacrificed to spotlight David, keeping the focus on David. So one writer says it this way. Davis again says it. He says, the writer then seems to do all he can to keep the spotlight and the responsibility squarely on David. The writer's being very careful. He's not going to let anybody else share the spotlight here. This is not a good spotlight. It's a bad spotlight, and nobody else is going to share it but David. And so he avoids anything else. Now, David's sin has rallied support against people having power. You know, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. We've been told that. We've heard that. One commentator says, he reflects that, and he says this: when piety clashes with power, piety comes off worse. Here, for the first time in the career of David, we see the moral dangers inherent in the possession of power. I find that a very odd statement because we do well to remember who gave David that power. And who was that? God. God gave David the power. We need to be careful that we're not saying that God made a mistake in giving David the power. Power doesn't corrupt. Money isn't the root of all evil. It's the love of money. It's the love of power. It's the abuse of power. God's the one who gave David all of this power. God also gave David great military acumen and immense riches as well. What happened was not the fault of God who gave David the power. The fault was squarely David's. David let his guard down. David entertained sin. He did not exercise self-control. He did not do what Joseph did when he looked over the edge of his rooftop. He should have turned right around immediately and did what Joseph did and ran, but he did not. He looked and he began to entertain in his brain, and it eventually worked its way out. Very quickly it worked its way out. So understand that all of this that happens in chapter 11 and 12, all of it happened during the war with Ammon. You remember chapter 10. Joab goes after the Arameans, and Abishai, his brother, they split their armies. Joab went after the Arameans and defeated them. Abishai went after the Ammonites, and they went back into their city and closed their doors and hid. And then it says Abishai went back to Jerusalem. Well, here it is in the springtime, the following spring, they're going to go out and finish dealing with the Ammonites. And David doesn't go with them. So that's why I say this is not a long kind of affair. This is a very quick one-night kind of thing. And so it happens very quickly. It's not something that's eating at David necessarily for a long time, though he wasn't ready. He clearly wasn't ready for what he saw. And David wasn't in the right spot. He should have been out, as we'll say here, he should have been out leading his men. That's where he should have been. So we've read verse 1. Let's read verses 2 through 5, and then we'll make some comments on this. Now when the evening came, David arose from his bed and walked around on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful in appearance. So David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" David sent messengers and took her. And when she came to him, he lay with her. And when she had purified herself from her uncleanness, she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David and said her 3 words, "I am pregnant." So from the time that it happened to the time she's convinced I'm pregnant, she went and told David. And we'll see in verses 6 through 13, she knows it's not Uriah. She knows. There's no doubt in her mind. It's not Uriah. So there was 2 to 3 weeks in that, at least 2 to 3 weeks in that. Thinking of how things work biologically, there were 2 or 3 weeks there, at least, in that period of time. And she knew it wasn't her husband. She knew that. And we'll see we'll see that as we go through here. So chapter 10 saw the Ammonites retreating behind their walled city, Rabbah, and Rabbah is known today as Ammon, the modern city of Jordan, Ammon, Jordan. There it is. You've heard that term, right? That's the current city in Jordan today. Well, in David's day, it was the capital of the Ammonites. David went on to rout the Arameans, but nothing was resolved about the Ammonites, as we just noted. So the following spring, or another way to say that is at the turn of the year, which probably was the 1-year anniversary of the humiliation toward David's show of kindness. Remember that back in chapter 10, verse 2, the king Nahash died. He sent a little small group of men to express his condolences, to show his respect, because evidently Nahash had offered him some reprieve while he was running from Saul. This is probably a year later from that event. Joab is dispatched to resume military operations against Ammon. The David here is portrayed very different than the David in chapter 9 and chapter 10. In chapter 10, in chapter 9, he extended great loving kindness to Jonathan's son. Remember that, Mephibosheth? And in chapter 10, he extended kindness to the new Ammonite king. Here, the drive in chapter 11, moving David, is not loving kindness, but lust, is what's driving him here. Springtime was traditionally the time when military campaigns were begun. The end of the rainy season meant that the roads were in much better condition. Remember, the reality was that warfare was carried out in ancient Israel by farmers, not professional soldiers. There were no standing armies in Israel. At the time, these farmer soldiers had to take a break from war periodically to go back and farm the land and care for their families. They had to get the seeds in the spring. They could go out and fight and whatever. They needed to come home in the fall to harvest. When the seed was in the ground, the harvest was some months off, and there was a period of time in which the armies would re-engage. So it was in the springtime, at the time when the messengers, or time when the kings had gone forth. And verse 2 says, when evening, or that is dusk, when dusk came, David arose from his bed. Now the telling point here is that David had been napping in late afternoon, indulging himself when his men were on the battlefield. So why is it wrong for David to stay home while the rest of the men of Israel go to war against the Ammonites? Well, first of all, leading the nation in war is one of the main tasks of the king. This is one of the reasons why God gave Israel a king to begin with. Remember, we want a king to fight our battles, to represent us. It was a wrong request at the wrong time, but God always had in mind that he was going to give them a king. Alexander McLaren writes, David's actual fall into sin seems to have begun by the abdication of his functions as captain of Israel. Another commentator, Ronald Youngblood, writes, leading his troops into battle was expected to be the major external activity of an ancient Near Eastern ruler. The Israelites were certainly wrong in demanding a king, but they were not too far off in expecting that their king would lead them in war. The judges in the book of Judges that God had raised up for them earlier were usually men like Barak and Gideon who would lead the nation in battle against their enemies. That's why he raised them up, to deliver his people. And when God designated Saul as Israel's first king, his military role was clearly indicated in 1 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 15 and 16. So why doesn't David go to battle? Well, the text doesn't tell us why he's not at the battle. Pride could have been a factor. That is David's arrogance. God had been with David throughout all of his military encounters and given him victory over all of his foes. Perhaps David thought that this is a small battle, relatively speaking. The Ammonites are not going to be a great threat to us, or it's not going to require a great deal of exercise of energy to take the city. Maybe I don't need to be there. It's not necessary that I go. Maybe it was some of David's arrogance. God had given David a great name. Perhaps David had begun to believe his own press clippings. He began to feel invincible. Maybe he seems to have come to the place where he believes that his abilities are so great that he can lead Israel into victory, even though he is not with his men in battle. Honestly, the text doesn't say. All of these things could have been a factor. How old is David about this time? Well, we know the years that he reigned, and every once in a while a little bit of dating is given us as far as when his sons were born and different things like that. David is in his very late 40s. Some commentators say even middle 50s at this time when this happens. So he reigns 40 years, and he's well on the backside of the 40 years. Maybe 30 years into it, something of that nature. He was remarkably successful on the battlefield. He had accomplished some remarkable military feats, extending the borders of Israel and securing them against all the surrounding nations. Perhaps he thought he owed himself a rest. Chuck Swindoll has an interesting insight for living. He has an interesting statement here that he's written. He said, "Our greatest battles don't usually come when we're working hard. They come when we have some leisure, when we've got some time on our hands, when we're bored." Perhaps so. The Lord had given David rest earlier in chapter 7, and at that point, he had spent his time wisely. Remember, David had given him rest on every side, and what did he do? He started looking forward to, I want to build something for the Lord. I want to build the Lord's house. And that's when the Davidic covenant, that's when the Lord explained to him that you're not going to build a house for me, I'm going to build a house for you. And at that time when God had given him rest, he had spent that time wisely. Now, his lack of zeal will be followed by disastrous consequences. Never was there a case which showed more emphatically the dreadful chain of guilt to which a first act apparently insignificantly may give rise. That's coming from an older commentary about 1880. Never was there a case which showed more emphatically the dreadful chain of guilt to which a first act, apparently insignificant, may give rise. In other words, his first mistake was not being out in battle. And never was there a case where you saw such a seemingly insignificant act that went on to prove disastrous results. Now, being tempted is no sin. Everybody is tempted to sin in some regard, in some case. Being tempted is not a sin, but lingering over it, toying with it, flirting with it, that is inexcusable. And that's what Eve did. Eve heard the serpent saying, and then she looked at it, and she just thought to herself, she saw that the fruit was good to eat. It was good to look at. Well, maybe this serpent's maybe he's got a point here. When you start lingering over it, thinking about it, then it becomes inexcusable. Going on, pursuing it is inexcusable. And that was the case with Eve. We can tempt ourselves to such a degree that resisting the sin is no longer considered to be a possible option. The only question that remains is how we are going to do it. You see that in Genesis 3:6 in the case of Eve. In Genesis chapter 34 and verse 2, there's another example of thinking about too much, and then following through with actions. Genesis 34 and verse 2. You'll see a pattern here. When Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he took her and lay with her by force. This is Diana. Do you see that pattern? He saw, he took, and then he committed. And you're going to see the same thing with David. Joshua chapter 7 and verse 21. It's not just women. Joshua 7 verse 21, you're going to see something else. Note what happens here to the gentleman who took what was banned, was on the ban, Achan. Chapter 7 and verse 21. I begin reading at verse 22. So Achan answered Joshua and said, Truly I have sinned against the Lord, the God of Israel, and this is what I did. When I saw among the spoil a beautiful mantle from Shinar and 200 shekels of silver and a bar of gold, 50 shekels in weight, I saw it. And I thought about it, and I lingered over it. Then I coveted them. I didn't run, and took them. And behold, they are concealed in the earth inside my tent with the silver underneath it. There's the same pattern. That's the same pattern that James talks about. You look at something, you think about it, and it eventually comes out. You sow a thought, you reap a deed. You sow a deed, you reap a habit. You sow a habit, you reap a lifestyle. You sow a lifestyle, you reap an eternity. That's the way it goes. Ever so subtly that you don't realize where you're at in life sometimes. But that's the pattern. God says we should flee temptation. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 22. Run from this thing. Run from this thing. And God is faithful to help us handle it if we obey. But if we delay over it, we're doomed. We are doomed. Now as far as I could find, there's no indication in the text that Bathsheba deliberately positioned herself to entice David, nor is there any way of knowing whether Bathsheba was a willing or reluctant partner to the offense, or whether she even knew that her bathing was being watched. Again, the text just says absolutely nothing. It was dusk at the time, not real clear, not real bright. Looking down, perhaps there was a shadow. Who knows what he saw? We're not told. But there's no indication that any of these things, that Bathsheba did anything wrong. Now, true, and we don't have to put our head in the sand or act as though we have our head in the sand. The idea that Bathsheba was wholly innocent when she knew others could see her from the roof strains believability, right? I mean, Bathsheba knew the king lived there. And she knew people could see her on the roof. I mean, it strains believability for somebody to say she didn't know about that. But the text doesn't say that she knew it, or she did it for that purpose, or that anybody, or it doesn't lay fault on her at all. But she had to know. I mean, she had to have moved in the house before, long before she went out and bathed herself. David knew this. He lived in the place for a while before he went and looked over the edge of his. He knew all. Everybody knew this. It's not like everybody just moved in yesterday. And, I didn't know they could see me. I just moved in. It wasn't like that. It was dusk. Maybe Bathsheba thought it was dark enough for her to do this. So her motive, whatever it might have been, is not included here. It's omitted, and that reinforces the conviction that the story is not so much about Bathsheba's actions, but David's. The text focuses on David and his blameworthy behavior. David saw, he wanted, and he took. I saw the gold, I coveted it, and I took it. I saw her, and she was very pretty, and I took her. The pattern. There's your pattern, expressed in the book of James, all over again, over and over again. The text focuses on him. Bathsheba's desires, according to the story here, seem to have been irrelevant, and perhaps for that reason, they are not even recorded. Not even recorded. That's not to say that women should be. It doesn't matter the modesty of women. That's of course not to say that at all. The point of the passage here is that David was responsible. David entertained sin. David sinned. Verse 3. And this gets more and more tragic as we go on here. Bathsheba, who was she? Bathsheba is in many ways the most ambiguous of all the female characters in Samuel and Kings. because she plays such a seemingly prominent role and so little is known about her. She was the daughter of Eliam. It says here in 1 Chronicles chapter 3 and verse 5, it's the name is spelled differently, but it's the same man. Eliam, now get this. Eliam was the son of David's exceedingly wise advisor, Ahithophel. You've heard of that name, I'm sure, as you've been reading. 2 Samuel 15:12 and 2 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 23. So you have Ahithophel, who's David's wise counselor. You have Eliam, and Eliam has Bathsheba. So you can keep that in your thought here. This was not an obscure family. I doubt it would be an obscure family simply for the fact that Bathsheba and Uriah live at a place where David can see them from his balcony. That probably means they're not an insignificant family. So they're not an obscure family at all. Eliam, listen to this. Eliam, the son of Ahithophel, was one of David's mighty men. In chapter 23 of 2 Samuel here, he'll list David's mighty men, and he'll list a lot of their accomplishments, phenomenal accomplishments when we get there. So here's Ahithophel, exceedingly wise counselor to David. Eliam, who's one of David's mighty men. Possibly this man helped David and followed David while Saul was chasing him all those 2 or 3, 4 years. And then you have his daughter Bathsheba. Can you imagine wrecking that family? He wrecked the family. Just think about a good friend of a good friend, and this is your nephew, and you do something that just blows the family apart. David really, really messed up here. Eliam's father, Ahithophel, was David's respected and trusted counselor. Bathsheba knew the lifestyle of the military and was no stranger to royal affairs. This was not uncommon for her. Her grandfather, Ahithophel, her father, Eliam, she knew these things. Now, later, when Absalom makes his attempt to take over the throne, Ahithophel defected from David. And we'll see that when we get to these chapters. But Bathsheba's grandfather defected from David. Eliam remained with David. So now you have a split in the family. Is one thing that's caused. Bathsheba is married to Uriah, an officer in David's family, and a good man as well. Thus, Ahithophel's change of allegiance, his defection from David to Absalom, may have been in response to the execution of Uriah and the humiliation of his granddaughter, which offers a huge motive to do what he did. Perhaps his son Eliam tried to talk him out of it. We don't know. But nothing in the family is the same after this. A very sad observation. Here's another sad observation. David did not hesitate, even when he found out that Bathsheba was married. Didn't bother him, didn't blink an eye. Evidently didn't blink an eye. Look at verse 3. David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife?" Whoa. You should stop right there. This girl is the daughter of one of your mighty men. The wife of Uriah, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. David sent messengers, took her, and when he came to her, he lay with her. Didn't bat an eye that she was married. That crosses the line into adultery, and because she was married, both of them should have been stoned according to the law. But God was gracious. Bathsheba, as we noted earlier, Bathsheba gave birth to 4 sons. after the death of her first. This child that she is pregnant with now is going to die. But she's going to give birth to 4 other boys. It says in 1 Chronicles 3:5, these were born to him in Jerusalem, Shimei, Shobot, Nathan, and Solomon. 4 by Bathshua, the daughter of Emmanuel, or the daughter of Eliam. So they're going to have 4 more boys together after this. Verse 4. David had been a follower of the law, yet despite the law's injunction and the fact that the penalty of adultery was death, presumably both of which David knew, he knew these things, he sent messengers and took her. That's the pattern too often repeated. You see, you covet, you look at, and then you go after. That's James chapter 1 and verses 14 and 15. The words do not indicate force by David. He sent messengers and took her. I looked that up, tried to find out, did David rape her? No, there's no indication that the words took her indicate force. Now you got to remember, don't think like 20th and 21st century America. They did not have such freedoms. And when the king in these days, when a king said do this, then you did that. So I don't think that there may have been some conversation like, please my king, don't do this, something of that nature, but people didn't resist. People didn't say no to a king as often. So it's not as common as in that day as we might think. So David lay with her. The word lay could mean to go to sleep, lay down and go to sleep, as it does in Genesis 19. It could mean die, as in Genesis 47. But here it means they had sex with one another. They had sexual intercourse with one another. It means the same thing in chapter 13 and verse 14. Chapter 13, verse 14, it says, however, he would not listen to her. Since he was stronger than she, he violated her and lay with her. This is one of David's sons violating his half-sister. Tamar, I believe is her name. One of the sad effects of this sin that we're going to see. The second half of verse 4 sounds confusing, and 2 interpretations have been offered. You see, at the second half of verse 4, it says, there's a semicolon probably there, halfway through, and then it says, and when she had purified herself from her uncleanness, she returned to her house. Now what it sounds like is they committed sin with one another, and then she went through some bathing ritual to purify her, and then she went back home. But I don't believe that's what the text is communicating. So let's look at that. Two interpretations have been offered. One view is that the latter half of verse 4 refers to her uncleanness as a result of her sin, which is what I just said. As a result of her sin. And then one commentator says it this way, defilement from sexual intercourse rendered one unclean until evening, according to Leviticus 15 and verse 18. Now, the strength of that view is the placement in the text. Wow, it occurs at the second half of verse 4. It sure looks like there is this act, and then there's a ritual cleansing following the act. It sure looks like that. So the strength of the view is the placement in the text. Now, I don't know what your translation says, but there is, in my Bible, a semicolon right after the word her. He lay with her, semicolon, which is to give a little bit of not a real hard and bold break, but to give a break there so that the following statement is not just the next in sequence. I'll try to explain that in just a moment here. So that's one view. Defilement from sexual intercourse render her unclean until evening, and the strength of the view is the placement in the text. Another view is that David's sinful encounter with Bathsheba occurred after she had purified herself from her uncleanness. And that's according to Leviticus 15:19. That is, during the part of her cycle, her monthly cycle, when she was not in her monthly cycle, thus she was more likely to conceive. And what I think the text is saying here essentially is this. This happened, and so there is no doubt, no concern at all, this was not Uriah's son. Because she just completed her monthly cycle, she's purifying herself, and all that happened after she purified herself. She had not been with her husband. David is the dad. That's how sure she is that it's him. So here's the process of trying to of affirming that right now. The word uncleanness can have reference to many unclean things. Unclean food, metaphorically speaking, an unclean spirit from the land, or it can refer to female bleeding in Leviticus 15 and verse 25 and following. The word indicating a woman's monthly period, this is embarrassing, y'all. The word indicating a woman's monthly period is a different word than this. It also indicates that word that indicates the menstruation. Also is used for a polluted land. It's used for the worship of idols. It's used for something detestable in Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 21. Therefore, the word usage it doesn't contribute to this. We could say her uncleanness. Is there a word that means her monthly cycle specifically? Yes, there is, but it's also used for other things, and it's not the word here. That's used for also feminine bleeding. Not necessarily the cycle, but if there's something wrong, like the woman that we see in John who had an issue of blood. So the word usage here doesn't contribute to either one, either view. But here's something that you should think of. There is no ritual cleansing for adultery. Right? If you commit adultery, there's no ritual cleansing for adultery. What she's doing here is not prescribed in the law. Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 10, there was no ritual cleansing for adultery. This cleansing that she's participating in is not for adultery. There is no specification in the law for that. Second, the author has described each event in the narrative from verse 1 all the way through the first part of verse 4. He's described each one of these things by the use of a letter that means sequence. And then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, all the way down through the first part of verse 4. And then when it starts the second part of verse 4, it stops. There's no longer that little construction there that indicates sequence. It stops right there. So when you read your text and it says, and when she had purified, that's not a sequence. That's not indicating sequence right there. So that's a grammatical reason why I think view 2 here. David's sinful encounter occurred after she had purified herself from her uncleanness from her monthly time. It's just after her monthly time is when this happened. That's how she knows it's not her husband. That's why she can with confidence say in verse 5, I'm pregnant. And it was you. There was nobody else. That kind of thing. So beginning at, it's after the adulterous act is recorded, the author here switches to another kind of construction here that is not to be taken as a sequential event. So what does that say about verse 2? Verse 2, remember what verse 2 says? Now when evening came, David rose from his bed and walking around the roof on the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing. That's what he saw. He saw her bathing. So the Hebrew clause could be put, verse 2, he saw her bathing. That clause could be put in parentheses. Now at that time, verse 2, she was purifying herself from her uncleanness, from her monthly time. The action was completed prior to this event that we read about, David committing adultery with her. The action was completed prior to that, and the most natural referent would be to the cleansing of her monthly time that she's referring to, that she's bathing in verse 2. That's why she's bathing in verse 2. And you can go back in Leviticus and look at that. There are 7 days, and then there is a ritual cleansing from that. So here's the point, I think what the author is making. The point is that she had recently had a monthly time, which means that she wasn't pregnant, even when this adultery took place. She was not pregnant before that. Uriah, who was away at war, could not have been the father of the child she conceived. The text is being very clear that she was not pregnant by her husband. When David had intercourse with her, she was not pregnant. And the text makes that very clear. There's no way that David can slide out of this. Had he, like Job, made a covenant with his eyes, David, if he made a covenant with his eyes, had he resolved that when the idea of sin sought entrance into the imagination, it should be sternly refused admission? Had he, in a word, nipped the temptation in the bud, he would have been saved a world of agony and sin. It's a quote from a commentator. Had he made a covenant with his eyes, he would have saved himself a world of sin. Verse 5 indicates a lapse of time, long enough for Bathsheba to know that she was pregnant. It seems highly unlikely that Uriah had been with his wife, since she appears very confident at that point. And the text helps us by the latter part of verse 4. That's the way the author writes all of this. David really messed up here. And when he gets the word that I am pregnant, verse 6 begins. David sent to Joab, and he begins the plot to try to get rid of Uriah. No confession here. He doesn't see any way out of it. According to the law, they should be stoned, both of them. So this is very sad. Verses 6 through 13 next week is how he's going to try to get rid of Uriah. And then verses 14 and following is the actual death of Uriah. And then chapter 12, oh my goodness. Chapter 12, the Lord sent Nathan to David. Now in between those times, Psalm 32, Psalm 51, when I did not confess my sin was eating away at me. And finally, I came to a point where I confessed my sin. You'll see that in chapter 12. Any questions about this? Very hard study. A lot of questions to answer in here. And it's just, I can't believe David did that. But if you like David said, if you say to yourself, I could never, then you've taken the first step to your fall. You don't ever be surprised at what you're capable of. Any questions?